I'm a fan of the old, MacBook Air and the MacBook line. That's been declining over recent years, but people like me who need a small computer like that, that MacBook Air is going to be transformative again. But I was blown away, too, by, the A12X processor being in an iPad, which makes it a great device for creativity, for making movies, and the apps that will be developed on top of it. That's what always makes an Apple product like the iPhone or the iPad great, is just trying to guess the brilliant apps that people will develop. And some of that will be professional. If you're on an airline, instead of having the paper for the pilots and the flight crew, they now all use iPads. Well, there's so many different things like that in every different industry, from the creative industries to simply the manufacturing industries, that a very powerful iPad like that will do.
Kevin, here's what got my attention: pricing. We had been hearing coming into this that maybe we would get lower priced new versions of some of these products. Instead, you look at MacBook Air, $1199, 20% increase. Mac Mini, $799, a 60% increase. What is that telling us? Are they taking the higher average selling price template that we saw with iPhones and applying it now to some of these other devices?
As we've said before, Apple is a luxury consumer goods company at its core. And what we're seeing with this pricing is that even on their lower end devices, they're actually maintaining pretty high end pricing. So the fact that they finally updated the MacBook Air, which was introduced 10 years ago, gives them something at the low end of the market. But as you point out, it's a pricey low end. We saw recently with their iPhone announcement, they have the iPhone XR, which is $800 instead of $1,000 for the other new iPhone.
It's a bargain.
So yeah, the other takeaway, the other headline from today's announcement is that you should invest in people who make the adapters, because they're gradually shifting all their devices to these USB-C connectors, and most people don't actually have the connection cables that they need to plug their various devices into that.
That's a good point. Dan, what do you make of this, especially when we take a look at shares of Apple? Right now they're up about 0.5%, but they've been fluctuating between gains and losses this morning.
Well, it's interesting because, to me, obviously these are extension of existing products with new features, which is great. And I think what it shows is Apple's continuing to try to drive people into their ecosystem. It may not just be through the iPhone, it may be through these other products. And I think that's the real key in regards to increasing gross margins, is going to be increasing the services side. So I think the more they add to the hardware side and extend kind of products that they haven't really been adding on more recently, away from the phone, that will hit their vision, which is to continue to drive people into higher margin services business. And that's really, I think, the future for them in terms of continuing to post very strong profit growth.
That was a big piece of the Jeff Freeze note yesterday, and the amount of services that would be embedded in the stock price. We always talk about ASPs, what they move on EPS. Yeah. That's on phones, though.
It's mostly on
to know
phones,
what happens
exactly.
when they do it to Macs.
I don't know that really on a macro basis it really is going to move the numbers that much, just because of the volumes are not that extreme. It's interesting, the way Apple shares have traded, it is as if the market is viewing the company as a branded consumer goods maker, very stable, the way Warren Buffett has kind of tried to characterize Apple. Stock's down only, I say, 8.5% from its high. I looked at the S&P 500. The only tech stock that's down less from its high is Xilinx. So it's a kind of a niche semiconductor play, and Fiserv, a fintech company. So essentially, the market is saying there's safety here. There's 200 million iPhone units a year, give or take. That's fine. The ecosystem is healthy. They keep moving the ball with incremental improvements in other areas. That's fine. Buying back a ton of stock. Buffett's not selling any. It seems like a very simple case. The question is, in this type of market environment, will it leave the likes of Apple, the largest stock of all time, relatively untouched? And that's what we have to see.
I'm glad you brought that up about Apple versus the rest of FANG. Walter, do you agree with that? Has Apple sort of become, I guess, essentially a safety play, especially when you look at the sort of the broader landscape for big cap tech and all the volatility and selling we've seen there?
I think the important thing is to take tech stocks and realize that there are two types that are fundamentally different. One of them is the advertising-driven social media stocks like Facebook, Twitter, and others. whose market depends on advertising, harvesting consumer data, I think those are deeply threatened, both because the business model of only depending on advertising is threatened, and because even today, as I read that story in the New York Times about the poison and vitriol on Instagram, I think there's a growing distaste for those in the social media sector. On the other hand, you have stocks like Apple that aren't advertising driven for their revenues, that are making consumer products. And I think Amazon is probably a bit oversold now after the past couple of weeks, because Amazon is something that doesn't just depend on advertising, and Amazon is delivering real products and real services. So I would make that strong divide and not just call it a tech sector, make a distinction between the advertising-driven social media sector that I think is in deep trouble and should be in deep trouble because of the way it's affected society, versus the Apples and Amazons that actually make real products.
I think it's interesting, given that we have Facebook tonight and Cook speaking and coming off of his Brussels speech a couple of weeks ago. I mean, I wonder how much of a premium Apple deserves.
And we have Apple's earnings on Thursday also, so we're going to be able to follow up on that. I think Walter makes a good point, and what's interesting is within advertising, you're seeing that Amazon is actually changing the game there. We saw this in the recent earnings. While there was some disappointment around Amazon's growth rates, their advertising business is actually growing significantly. And we saw in Alphabet, we saw Google had some pressure, some slight pressure on their advertising business. So to Walter's point, the business, there's a lot of threats to the businesses that are in the advertising, not to mention cyclical and recession concerns that are related to advertising. But we're seeing increasing competition between them, with Amazon more seriously playing in there.